Hello, so in this video I'm going to be discussing with you data collection, data management and particularly how to use that in your research. So to start off with, because my research background, I've worked with both primary, secondary, qualitative and quantitative data methods to conduct various research projects. But what I want to discuss with you today is a general overview of what goes into data collection, different techniques you can use and why some methods work better than others, some of the pitfalls of those particular methods, and really what you can do with that, with those different techniques or methods, or what you need to look out for. Now, to start off with, the method that I'm currently using in my project is qualitative. So that's taking effectively using social science and educational theory to really try to understand the different interactions that are taking place with students. And in my case, I'm trying to understand what particular relationships are going on within the academic relationships that students have with their courses, and really trying to interpret how they make their decisions and bringing in different theories to support my research. And whilst that research is still ongoing, I'm currently using one-to-one and group interviews to conduct that. Now, those two methods, a one-to-one interview is a very useful deep dive into that individual's process. You can have a more detailed conversation and understand why they've taken an approach that they have, what justifies their approaches, why they've done that, go into more particular reasons that you might not be able to explore in a more wider group context, or that you wouldn't be able to collect in a qualitative data survey. However, the pitfall often is, because it's very highly personable, it's very difficult in some cases to replicate that particular sample, because whether you are using individuals from a similar cohort or from a similar environmental background, they're generally going to be very much individual as well as a representative of that group. So that's something you've got to bear in mind when you're taking your approach using qualitative data. Now, if you're using a group interview might give you the opportunity to explore and understand why students are coming to a consensus about a particular approach, or why they have a particular challenge with that approach that's going on. Or if you're doing a group interview to try to work out how they interpret marketing techniques, or from a commercial point of view, trying to get to an understanding of what those individuals are effectively evidencing or showing you in terms of their relationship with the methods that you're trying to explore. Focus groups generally are different from group interviews because of the consensus they try to bring, whereas a group interview is a discussion where you might discuss various elements and do not need to come to that consensus. A focus group, you want a consensus across that group. You might get the overview comments, such as how they like a product, dislike a product, why they like it and why they dislike it, but generally you're still going to try to get that group consensus to see whether that advice can be taken to research and development committees, or how it gets developed further. Now, other things that you might use in qualitative research, there is cases where you can use observation, where you can observe individuals doing a particular task. This often gets mirrored into a form of psychometric testing. If you're going for an interview process and you've done a psychometric test before, you've probably also done an assessment center, and to an extent observations that you would see in research often will also get used in qualitative research methods to effectively give a group a task or an individual a task, and seeing how they approach or solve that particular problem. Now, when you are looking at generally very specific individual case data, or where you're analyzing a large sample, qualitative data is trying to give you that a very subjective overview of that particular sample that you're using. You have a particular method. You're using that particular method to try to see how what influence that individual or that group has had, or what has had an influence on that group or individual, and you're trying to understand that and trying to rationalize with that. As a result, a lot of qualitative data can generally be taken as an individual's opinion and trying to discuss why they think that opinion is the best solution to that particular problem. Now, often, even when qualitative data, if it's like the case of mine, is your primary data source, you will have other data that you are collecting in that process. So quantitative data often will form the backbone of the starting point for your research, and the quantitative data is also generally there in more specific data sets where you're looking to explore very large samples that can be clearly measured for using different tools, different formats. So if you're looking at environmental emissions, you might have CO2 emissions as a quantifiable variable. You might have speed if you're looking at how fast something moves over a given distance. Or it might be something that you are looking at reviewing module interest, or you can still use that quantifiable element to explore why individuals like, dislike, but it's generally very specific to clear measurable variables. And while a survey can generally have open questions, more qualitative data, and quantifiable data, which is more your looking at set characteristics or measures, you can have a combination of the two in a survey technique. Now, when you're looking at quantitative data, that can generally be your lab techniques that you're exploring, and looking at how you might have a control sample where you have say you're doing a feed measurement, when doing a research project before looking at animal feed. One of the experiments was using different active ingredients to assess whether it has a better influence on leg strength in broilers. And that particular active ingredient, you had one active ingredient, you had one that had that active ingredient at different measures, and then you had a placebo, which effectively were a group that weren't given that active ingredient at all. And then the assessment was eventually looking at whether that active ingredient had any form of long-term benefit or short-term benefit to the stock. Now, you've got the effectively you have your elements where you're looking at that lab variable that's clearly statistically measurable outcome, but you can also have different techniques that you might look for and might explore. So if you're looking at, you've got your lab environments, you have whether you are looking at survey techniques, equally whether you're looking at putting some form of program together where you are running variations of code to see what is the solution to a particular problem, and it might be a project-based quantitative study. But one of the things that you need to bear in mind of, regardless of if you're using quantitative measurements or if you're using qualitative measurements, is the research design that you're looking at. So giving a few examples of different common techniques that you might see across quantitative and qualitative research. So qualitative, you might start with grounded theory, where you start with your data and then you look at the particular theories that you could apply to that, or try to better understand what your data effectively says after the fact. You might use phenomenology, where you're effectively seeking to understand meaning and essence of an experience. So you wanting to understand why people do a particular decision that they have, what leads them to that decision, and why that effectively is the case. Why have they come to that solution or that scenario? If you have a narrative analysis, you're looking at more what they've written, whether it be an essay, whether it be a discussion. You're trying to understand how their approaches led them to develop their identity, their feelings, the development of their preconceptions. You're trying to understand that relationship. Ethnography, effectively looking at you can generally see this in both studies of anthropology or in animal studies in some cases, where you're effectively trying to be in that environment and just passively observing. So you're there for a longer period of time, just observing any trends. There are inherent elements of risk to these particular methods. So you might your presence may unfortunately influence the subjects that you're studying, but it's a valuable way of effectively observing cases in a natural environment. So a case study, you can have cases in psychology where you might be observing individuals, having that discussion with different individuals, and you're seeing what solutions you can ascertain from that. And then you've got content analysis, which I'm effectively using this in my own research, looking at analysing visual diagrams to ascertain how an individual's drawing or the visualization of their thoughts and concepts effectively influence a particular idea, and then it can be applied to the other methods that are being used. So in business, your qualitative data is often your market research, your user testing. So when you are sending your products out for individuals to test and to use, that is your qualitative research. So what you also need to be thinking about when you're approaching that type of data collection is, what are you hoping to gain from that? Do you want to give them entirely open options to review it for, or do you want to give them set questions that you're trying to get them to observe? Think of what the benefits might be to give them more guidance and the potential pitfalls by giving them more or less options to choose from. So for example, if you are giving them a product, is it more beneficial for you to know against certain points and you want to direct them to that way, but then you are also acknowledging that they may have other points that they have not added to your review or to your feedback, and therefore you might want to just leave them an open question at the end, or you might want to follow that up with other points depending on the type of development or user testing you want. Also bear in mind that when you are in the business, your customer feedback, their general reviews that they have of your business, is also qualitative data that you're looking at. If you use things like thematic analysis, you can try to ascertain common themes that are emerging about a particular element of your business. If you're a service-based business, think about what they're saying when they're both satisfied with your service and what they're saying when they aren't as happy with your service. What are the common themes? Where can you improve? Where can you adjust? Now, if you're watching this video from an academic perspective, this is very much looking at your participant observations and why they're effectively you're giving them a task and how they're approaching that particular task. You may interview them and be actively involved in the process yourself and trying to have that conversation with them. You may do, as I mentioned earlier, the focus group, where you're trying to get them to develop a consensus. Personal context, you might be looking at, you're working at it from a care or psychology point of view, you might have the autoethnography approach, where you're trying to get them to reflect on their own experiences and why they've come from that, or trying to explore that more personal narrative, where they're effectively exploring those particular reasons why they've experienced that. So very much think about where you have interviews that you've probably observed on TV, where you have someone who's interviewing a particular famous person and trying to explore their techniques and their methods of why they've come to those particular ideas or formats in their professional life. And political context, you'll also have public opinions. So generally what we see in the UK with YouGov surveys, those will give you an idea of what certain people, especially in the open side of that, what effectively the general feelings that people have to a particular outcome or option. And again, case studies can be used in the political context. So now in terms of quantitative research, so a lot of the benefits of quantitative research is in the generalization that it's able to be applied across a wider scope than what your more of a subjective qualitative approach may be. You can be more objective within your quantitative research. You don't need to bring in that personal theoretical approach. It can be very using existing methods or the well-established theoretical testing, and really using that in a way that minimizes any subjectivity that you may have to that particular cases that you're working with. Because it can be repeated and replicated more easily, the reliability of your data also can be used to effectively explore data in a larger context, and which effectively allows other scientists to use that same method and apply it to another project, even in a similar environment, but on a completely different location, time zone, country, or so on. So in terms of some of the risks that you can have with quantitative data, you are reducing what you effectively you're taking a reductionist approach to your data. So whilst you might be working with that particular research or with that particular data, you're having to limit some of the wider assumptions or wider areas of exploring that particular subjective narrative, because you're not effectively collecting that information. So because you aren't collecting it, and because it is subjective, you will be missing out some of the data that you could otherwise have been collected. There can sometimes be a lack of context, which again might need to be explored first in a qualitative sense or in a wider quantitative sense to give you that theoretical underpinning to explore that data in more detail. And in the same respect, as with any scientific approach, you can have a limitation in terms of the scope of your exploration, where you might otherwise have needed to have a wider, broader study beforehand. So again, quantitative data can be used in market research, can effectively give you indications of trends and behaviours, what consumers are picking from a shelf, why they're picking a particular item from a shelf, why they're moving in the way they do, why traffic flows in the way it does, or why people are buying particular cars. Now that will just give you buying trends and arguments of why, giving you the justification to explore the broader whys of the reasons why people are approaching those particular topics, and it gives you those trends to justify why that approach will be taken. Health research and social sciences can also, your quantitative data can often give you that underpinning of why you particularly want to explore those particular options. And in the social science, it may particularly give you the understanding of some of the core background information. So in surveys I've used, it's looking at that core background understanding of what the demographics that the subjects are coming from. If you're doing it from health research, you might be looking at data such as body mass index trends. You may be looking at it from weight, height, age, in terms of being able to gauge is there any particular statistical relevance with different things that different individuals have in common. So in terms of in business, it does give you the opportunity to explore category management and really explore why individuals have certain behaviors within their category or outside of their categories. What are their approaches to buying particular goods? Why are they approaching that particular buying habit? What can you use as a business to influence that buying habit? You can use it to explore just very simple A and B testing, preference testing. Do they prefer option 1 or do they prefer option 2? What is their reason for that? It is more the social science side of it, the qualitative, but the quantitative side can give you the very quick, I prefer A over B, and then that can give you the amount of people who prefer one option over the other, and you can use the other demographic reasons to try to understand how your product would fit in that category. And you can use that for both how the product tastes, how the packaging is seen, how the general experience is effectively used by the individual. So in academia, quantitative data is generally used for randomized controlled trials, so where you can compare one animal study where you're testing, as I said with the broiler example, where you're testing a particular new ingredient, versus ones that are on a placebo and seeing if there's any trends or benefits in that. Or longitudinal studies where you're measuring a data over a long drawn out period of time to effectively see how data trends have been interpreted or been measured over different long-term periods. This is where you get from meteorological data, where you hear samples such as this is the warmest year since records began, and those type of examples that the media can then take often comes from those quantitative data sets. In more the public and political realms, you have your public opinion polls, exit polling, where you can get an indication of how the vote is particularly going to go and why that's going to go in that way isn't explored, but you can get a general understanding of where the public are particularly going on a particular choice. And again, electoral polling, the vote preference really does give a quantitative context to that. So in terms of tools and software that you might use, so you can have data collection apps. There are also different validation checks that you might do, or automating your data collection. If you use tools in this way to effectively, whether you're using a different company to help you collect that data, or whether you're a researcher who wants to use different tools, I've put together a bit more of a guide for you for this on my Substack newsletter. So do click the link in the description to effectively find that, and then scroll down to that particular point where I'll discuss those elements for you and explore what you can use for the different data management tools that you need. So do explore those areas in that. Now, in terms of how you use data, the reason why I effectively wanted to put this into this video and why I'm still doing this before the ethical review is you need to have a bit more of an understanding of what you are effectively trying to measure with your data before you go into that deep dive of the science that you're going to explore. You need to have the context to understand what you're doing it for, why you're doing it, and therefore you can put that into the ethical submission for whether you're doing it for your BSc, MSc or PhD, or whether you're doing it for another research project. You need to have that justification for why you're doing it. So when you are managing that data, you need to know how you get roughly how you're going to analyze the data, what type of data you're going to select. Are you going to use a mixed method? Are you going to use solely one method? What existing methodologies have been applied that you can then apply to your own work? Why are you using that method over others? Will be opportunities where if you know the answer why you've chosen one method over the other already, make a note of it, because that will help in your justification, your vivas, or reflective accounts of why you've chosen a particular method over another. So in terms of ethical considerations, the main thing that you need to remember when you're thinking about your ethics is why are you doing it? How can you minimize the impact on the study subjects? What is the justification for doing it in the first place? What benefit is it to the wider audience or wider sample base? And finally, is your work justifiable? Is the data that you are going to collect going to have a benefit for the funders, for the individuals taking part, for the wider population? Why are you doing it in the first place? That's what the ethics committees at different institutions want to know. So thank you very much for tuning into this video. Next week I will be going through the ethics form itself and going through the discussion of what really goes into an ethical form, why you need to do it to effectively complete and justify your research, and then how to apply that ethics form to the individual institution or your individual data that you're going to collect. So thank you very much.